What if the true significance of Tuesday's Trump-Putin agreement isn't what was signed, but what was strategically left unsaid? On March 18, 2025, after more than 2 hours of intense discussion, Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin reached a limited agreement on Ukraine, one that falls short of the comprehensive 30-day ceasefire previously proposed by the United States. Instead, they agreed to a narrower halt on attacks against energy infrastructure while committing to further negotiations. This diplomatic chess match represents the latest development in the evolving Russia-Ukraine conflict that has raged for over 3 years. According to the White House, this agreement marks the first step in a movement to peace that could potentially include a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea and eventually a comprehensive peace plan. But beneath the surface optimism lies a complex web of competing interests, strategic calculations, and historical precedents that demand deeper analysis. The agreement reached between Trump and Putin has very specific boundaries worth examining. Putin rejected the full 30-day ceasefire across all fronts that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had previously secured Ukraine's approval for. Instead, he accepted only Trump's proposal for a 30-day pause on targeting energy infrastructure. According to the Kremlin's statement, during the conversation, Donald Trump proposed that both parties refrain from targeting energy infrastructure for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded positively and immediately instructed the Russian military accordingly. This limited scope is significant because it protects Russia's vulnerable energy sector, while potentially restricting Ukraine's growing capability to strike Russian fuel facilities and refineries, a tactic that has recently given Ukraine leverage. The White House readout states that the leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire and permanent peace. But experts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies caution that tactical pauses often benefit the side with greater resources and manufacturing capabilities, in this case, Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky's response to this agreement remains cautious. Just 1 day before the Trump-Putin call, Zelensky expressed significant doubt about Putin's sincerity for peace, stating, "It is Putin who continues this war." This skepticism stems from bitter experience. Ukraine has seen previous ceasefire agreements, including the Minsk Accords of 2014 and 2015, repeatedly violated. Ukraine now faces a difficult strategic dilemma. According to AP reporting, Ukrainian forces are currently retreating from portions of Russia's Kursk region that they had previously captured, losing a critical bargaining chip as talks for a ceasefire with Russia gain momentum. This weakened position comes precisely as Trump has repeatedly emphasized that Ukraine lacks leverage in negotiations. Further complicating matters is Trump's recent contentious meeting with Zelensky, during which U.S. officials reportedly asked Ukrainian representatives to leave midway through discussions. This strained relationship undermines Ukraine's ability to influence the terms of any potential peace agreement, with Ukrainian defense analyst Oleksandr Musyenko warning that Ukraine risks being pushed into concessions without corresponding security guarantees. Vladimir Putin's careful approach to these negotiations reveals sophisticated strategic thinking. By accepting only a limited ceasefire while rejecting broader terms, he maintains military pressure on Ukrainian forces across the front lines while protecting Russia's energy infrastructure from increasingly effective Ukrainian strikes. More significantly, the Kremlin has established clear preconditions for any broader peace talks. According to their readout, a key condition for resolving the conflict involves terminating Western support for Ukraine. It was stressed that halting foreign military assistance and intelligence sharing with Kyiv is essential for preventing the escalation of the conflict. This demand would effectively disarm Ukraine while allowing Russia to continue its military buildup. Research from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace suggests Putin's approach mirrors his negotiating tactics during previous conflicts, where limited agreements serve to fragment Western unity while buying time for military consolidation. Dr. Alexander Gabuev, director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, notes that Putin consistently uses diplomatic processes to create the appearance of progress while pursuing unchanged strategic objectives. Today's limited ceasefire exists within a much larger historical context of failed peace efforts. The current negotiations bear striking similarities to previous attempts to end the conflict, particularly the Istanbul Communiqué of March 2022. According to diplomatic historians, those negotiations produced a framework where Ukraine would declare neutrality, limit its military forces, and abandon NATO membership plans in exchange for security guarantees from Western countries and Russia. That promising agreement collapsed following the discovery of the Bucha massacre in April 2022, which inflamed Ukrainian public opinion against concessions. As Dr. Angela Stent, former U.S. National Intelligence Officer for Russia, explains, the history of Russia-Ukraine negotiations demonstrates a pattern where promising diplomatic openings are often undermined by ground realities or new military offensives. Even earlier, the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 attempted to freeze the conflict following Russia's initial intervention in eastern Ukraine. Those ceasefires had the potential to stabilize the situation, but sporadic offensives by Russia-backed separatists continued, demonstrating the challenge of enforcing agreements without robust international monitoring mechanisms, an issue that remains unaddressed in the current proposal. President Trump's approach represents a dramatic departure from his predecessor's Ukraine policy. Where President Biden pledged support for Ukraine for as long as it takes, Trump has prioritized quickly ending the conflict, even at the potential cost of Ukrainian sovereignty. As he stated just before the call with Putin, it's a dire situation in both Russia and Ukraine. What is transpiring in Ukraine is troubling, but we will see if we can negotiate a peace agreement, a ceasefire, and I believe we can achieve it. This shift has profoundly altered Ukraine's strategic calculations. After briefly suspending military aid and intelligence support earlier this month, the U.S. restored assistance following Ukraine's acceptance of the ceasefire proposal. This carrot-and-stick approach has effectively forced Ukraine to accept American terms, regardless of battlefield conditions. According to former Pentagon official Bradley Bowman, the U.S. has consistently provided preemptive concessions that have weakened both American and Ukrainian negotiating power. There exists a significant risk that the administration's strategy is reducing to offering penalties for Ukraine while rewarding Putin. This assessment highlights the fundamental tension in current U.S. policies. European leaders are responding to these developments with growing concern and unprecedented defense initiatives. Just before the Trump-Putin call began, Estonia's prime minister announced plans to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, a remarkable level for a NATO country. Simultaneously, Poland and the Baltic states gave notice of their withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention, banning anti-personnel landmines, signaling their belief that conventional deterrence measures are increasingly necessary. Even Germany, historically cautious about military investments, has taken dramatic steps, voting to loosen constitutional debt restrictions for defense spending and establishing a €500 billion fund for infrastructure. These moves reflect a profound loss of confidence in American security guarantees under the current administration. According to analysis from the European Council on Foreign Relations, European nations are preparing for a scenario where they must take greater responsibility for their own security. Britain and France are leading efforts to create a reassurance force that would deploy to Ukraine once a lasting ceasefire takes effect, representing an unprecedented European security initiative outside NATO structures. Beyond security calculations, significant economic interests underpin these negotiations. Both Trump and Putin emphasize potential enormous economic deals that could emerge from improved US-Russia relations, with energy cooperation specifically highlighted. These economic incentives create powerful motivations for both leaders to reach some form of agreement. Trump has specifically mentioned dividing up certain assets as part of a potential deal to end the war, and previously referenced Ukraine's minerals as potential payback for American assistance. This transactional approach to diplomacy raises questions about whether Ukrainian resource wealth is being leveraged as part of these negotiations. Energy economist Brenda Schaffer notes that Russia's attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have destroyed approximately 80% of the country's power generation capacity, making the protection of remaining infrastructure vital for Ukraine's survival, but also creating potential opportunities for foreign investment in reconstruction. This economic dimension adds another layer of complexity to negotiations that extend far beyond security considerations. The path from limited agreement to comprehensive peace faces formidable challenges. As Pentagon analyst Michael Kaufman observes, enforcement mechanisms remain the Achilles heel of any agreement in this conflict. Neither the current limited ceasefire nor proposed follow-on agreements specify verification procedures or consequences for violations. Previous ceasefire attempts during this war have collapsed due to mutual accusations of violations. According to the Kremlin's own statement, Putin cited serious risks stemming from the Kiev regime's history of sabotaging and violating previously established agreements as a reason for rejecting the broader ceasefire. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials point to Russia's history of using ceasefires to reposition forces and launch new offensives. The White House indicated that negotiations would begin immediately in the Middle East, but critical questions remain unanswered. Will Ukraine participate directly in these talks? What monitoring mechanisms will verify compliance with the energy infrastructure ceasefire? And perhaps most importantly, how will disagreements be resolved if violations occur? These implementation details will determine whether this agreement represents a genuine path to peace, or merely a temporary pause in hostilities. As negotiations advance, several critical markers will indicate whether this limited agreement represents genuine progress toward peace or merely a tactical pause. First, watch whether follow-up discussions in the Middle East include direct Ukrainian participation or continue through separate US-Russia and US-Ukraine channels. Second, monitor compliance with the energy infrastructure ceasefire, particularly whether both sides refrain from strikes on power plants and fuel facilities. Third, observe how European security initiatives develop, especially the proposed reassurance force led by Britain and France. Fourth, track whether US military assistance to Ukraine continues flowing or faces new restrictions. These indicators will reveal the true trajectory of this peace process more reliably than diplomatic statements or social media posts. Here at Omni, we recognize that understanding these complex geopolitical developments requires looking beyond surface-level agreements to the underlying interests, historical patterns, and strategic calculations. Thousands of viewers worldwide rely on our analysis to navigate these critical developments. Join them by subscribing today. What's your assessment of this limited ceasefire agreement? Do you see it as a genuine path to peace or a strategic repositioning? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tomorrow, we'll examine how China is responding to these developments and what its growing relationship with Russia means for global security architecture. The insights will transform how you understand the emerging multipolar world order. Don't miss